Cosa
Let me introduce our first speaker for the morning. It's Tom MacNeil. Tom is a candidate of the Master's in Divinity at MacNeil College, and he will talk to us about cognitive science and religion, a tapestry of living. I would like to mention before I welcome you up that Tom is a graduate of the cognitive science major.
Thank you. At my theological college, when I say that I've been educated in cognitive science, I get an array of responses. Some people think that I'm just some sort of psychology person. Other people think that I'm trying to build Skynet, especially if they find out that I have a computer science background. And there are probably a few who think that I'm going to revolutionize how we do ministry in the United Church, being able to reach people on a deeper and more intellectual level. I've also been asked how I can reconcile religion and cognitive science. At first glance, from what Brian Cantwell Smith might call the classical view, cognitive science and religion seem to be odd bedfellows. Cognitive science, like other sciences, is interested in the physical world. It's not interested in spooky explanations for why we make decisions the way we do. And for some people, this is what religion is concerned with. Explain my brain. We can't do it with science, so let's try and do it with some spookiness here. But I disagree with this apparent dichotomy between religion and science. I think they play a very synergistic role. Not only that they can, but that they have played that role. And I'd like to look at that relationship mainly from a cognitive science standpoint. I'm not trying to assign any priority to cognitive science in doing this. I just know who's in my audience here. First, as with any good essay, I want to outline a few terms. Then I want to investigate what can cognitive science draw from religion. And then, what can cognitive science offer religion? And perhaps I'll end with a suggestion for some future directions that this relationship might take. So for any non-cognitive science people here, I'd like to very quickly define what cognitive science is. According to the U of T website, cognitive scientists seek an understanding of such mental phenomenon as perception, language, learning, and reasoning in information processing terms. And they aim to integrate this understanding with a neurophysiological account of how the human brain implements these information processing phenomena. It's a very physicalist approach to what's going on in our heads. It isn't interested in saying, well, science can't figure that out. It will ask the questions. It wants to find a natural explanation for what's going on in our heads. And for me, the idea that there is a natural explanation just makes the whole process a little bit more special. Kind of like figuring out a magic trick. Now, when it comes to religion, our definitions tend to be a bit more normative. Something is a religion because that's what we're calling it. It's a religion because it's a religion. And this lack of criticality has some troubling developments. You have some oddball churches like the Church of Scientology, Church of Satanism, even the New Jedi Order, which all claim to be religions. Now, in some cases, this is obviously a joke. In some places, they may be motivated by tax breaks. But is it right to call these movements religions? I think there should be some essential definition of what constitutes a religion. Now, John Vervaeke a few years ago proposed an idea of a secular spirituality. And he thought that spirituality involved creating a sense of connection to oneself, to others, and to reality. Now, according to the Handbook of Psychology of Religion and Spirituality, religion is a personal or group search that unfolds within a traditional sacred context. And I don't think it's too far a stretch to say that that search is for the connection to oneself, others, and reality. So I'm going to refer to religion as a culture that exists to facilitate spirituality, this connection. So now the really touchy subject. What about this God figure? Well, I'm going to completely ignore the theistic debate in this talk. I am a candidate for ordination. Someday I might be a minister, so I think it's pretty clear where I stand on this debate. But I want to avoid it for two reasons. First off, I don't think a particular conception of God is necessarily a part of religion. There's significant debate on the nature of God already, within Christianity and within larger religions. Some religions, it doesn't even matter if you have a God or not. Now, I realize this disentanglement might be a little uncomfortable for some people, and I hope you'll bear with me if you experience this discomfort. The other reason I want to avoid the theistic debate is I feel it will detract from the topic at hand. I'm not here, and I never am here, to sell a particular concept of God. I have my concept. I'm happy with it. You all have your concepts. You're happy with them. I don't feel that the topic of religion, qua religion, is enriched by debates over who's right and who's wrong. And I've seen far too often that's where the theistic debate takes us. So now that I've put some limits on what I'm going to try and cover, let's move on to the meat of the talk. What can cognitive science draw from religion? Well, to understand this, we have to see what would a world without religion look like. And our nearest relatives in the animal kingdom show us that, I think. Apes are basically humans without religion. Now, I'm not trying to make a pejorative statement about apes or about atheists. I'm staying away from that. But I think there are some very clear places where religion has affected us cognitively. And I think that cognitive science can look at these religious practices and traditions for some of their studies. Colleen Chance has argued that emotion has a very real place in cognition, and religion takes advantage of this use of emotion in cognition. Joni Sasaki has researched how subjective well-being is embedded in culture and how it's linked and affected by faith. And Matt Rosano has argued that ritual drove cognitive development. Colleen Chance observes that we frequently do not look at the conditions that lead to the creation of a particular biblical text or any other religious text. Our focus on these texts is what can we do with them? What can they mean for us? How can we use them in day-to-day life? But this is only half the story. These came from somewhere, and where they came from, the conditions that they came from, what inspired them can be equally important. In one instance, we can see the integration of social opposites. The passage that I'm talking about is in Galatians, where Paul says, "There is no more Greek nor Jew, male nor female, slave nor free." And we see these two different groups in all of these pairings, and one group is viewed with disgust. It's this emotion of disgust that maintains this separation between the groups. Now, contrary to what Star Trek would have you believe, emotion is very necessary for reasonable behavior. We've seen in people who have injuries to their dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and their right parietal lobe that they lose not only a certain class of emotions, but they're completely unable to deal with daily life. Emotions form an appraisal system. They can orient us to threats and benefits in the world. Now, early religious leaders recognized this, and cognitive science can recognize this as well. Studies have been conducted that explore the link between cognition and emotion. Now, in the Shantz article that I'm referring to, the Galatian passage directs us to use another emotion, awe, to overcome this idea of disgust to the other. So rather than using an intellectual argument, we see an emotional argument being used to overcome this disgust. Sasaki went and investigated the link between uncertainty avoidance and how it moderates faith and subjective well-being. Now, it's clear that a very strong belief in a higher power can help to alleviate some uncertainty. I'm not going to worry about this, it's all in God's hands now. Sasaki investigated how this link works and how it's moderated. She expected to find that in societies with a lot of risks, where people really want to avoid uncertainty, you would find very strong, faithful people to be more happy. And the study showed a little correlation to this effect. But what's important to notice is that even in societies where there was low risks, where people weren't as worried about day-to-day survival, there was still this strong positive correlation. It seems that faith and religion has more to offer. And one possible idea for this is that faith and religion form stronger social groups. And this helps to improve people's well-being. So this shows that religion isn't just some optional add-on to our life, but that religion forms a very important core part of our life, and that religion and culture can have a very powerful effect on us. Matt Rossano has argued that ritual drove certain cognitive developments, such as the increase in working memory. Working memory is what we use to hold information that we're currently using. If I give you a short list of things to remember, it's probably going to end up in your working memory. Now, because we have such a larger working memory than most other primates, we can model the world more effectively. And since rituals and religions help to focus attention, we can inhibit our actions. And this is very advantageous. Normally, if we see someone from another tribe, we attack them. But if we can inhibit that action, we can maybe create some peace, some trade alliances. So rituals for Homo sapiens require agents to coordinate a large number of things. You need to know what the various steps in the dance are, what songs to sing, what prayers to say. This is something that all members of a tribe can participate in, from the oldest to the youngest. Unlike things like tool making and hunting, children can participate in this ritual. So rituals help to expand our working memory and inhibitory control by allowing us to deal more deliberately with the world rather than instinctively. And individuals are selected for this. We could start to plan with greater working memory. We could avoid seeing groups as competitors. And cognitive science can investigate how these rituals can benefit our daily life. So religion provides a fertile ground for cognitive science to investigate. We can see instances of emotion affecting how people view the world. We see instances of how subjective well-being is influenced by religion. And there is growing evidence that religion and rituals have affected our very evolution. So we can't just dismiss religion. It's had an effect on us. And in cognitive science, we need to study that. But now what can cognitive science offer religion? Because I don't think this relationship is one way. Without cognitive science or sciences in general, we would end up in a world that would lack criticality. Religion to lay people tends to be very, very normative. In some cases, people don't even engage in critical reflection of what religious institutions are, what they do. And this can lead to a religious organization losing its bearing, losing its direction, becoming a benign social club, but it can also lead to fundamentalism that we've seen unfortunately far too recently and far too close to home. And we really haven't had tools to prevent this from happening. It's been opinion versus opinion. But with cognitive science, I think we can expand this debate with something a little more solid than opinion while still being respectful of that belief. And some of our presenters here have already begun to answer the question of what cognitive science has to offer. Brian Cantwell-Smith has discussed how the convenient dualism between the physical and the non-physical doesn't seem to hold, and where science needs to go in response to this discovery. Jim Davies has looked at why we value testimony as highly as we do, and James Carse has talked about how myths are vital to our shared experience. Jordan Peterson has investigated the correlation between religious organizations and their political views. And Matt Rosano has looked at religions as arenas to develop our moral faculties. So Brian Cantwell-Smith has indicated that we need better answers from science, something that's a little bit more encompassing. Science can't just help us to understand facts anymore. We need to go beyond and understand how these facts connect with us and the world. The 20th century brought out three really important developments in science. First off, we found that the world was no longer a collection of objects. It was constituted by tiny points of something else. Suddenly, this wasn't as fundamental as we thought it was. We also found out that, surprise, surprise, we're a part of this world. We aren't just observers looking through a one-way looking glass at the world. We're part of it. As we observe it, we change it. And now this led us to investigate scientifically not only what we know, but how do we know this? We began to realize how entangled we were with the world. And if we were entangled, old ideas of formality, that the world could be neatly divided into little boxes, started to fall away. We also realized, and now we knew, that we could never approximate, or that we could only ever approximate the world. We could never precisely represent what the world was. So things that we used to take as absolutes, truth, goodness, justice, could in fact be highly subjective. And as scientists, we need to recognize the limits of our rationality. I'm not saying this to stop the quests. We need to ask the questions. But it's important in a pluralistic world that we realize these things, that there are relative aspects to truth. Jim Davies says that one aspect of religious transmission lies in testimony. Sorry, I say that. Jim Davies talks about testimony in general. So much for my notes. We value testimony quite deeply. What other people tell us, we take that very, very personally. Jim Davies asks, why do we take it so personally? Why do we attach such importance to what other people say? Some people think that the reason why we put so much value to it is that we can get more beliefs from testimony than from other sources. But this doesn't seem to hold water, because in order to form these beliefs, we had to be given other beliefs. And if we say that testimony is at least as reliable as other forms of belief, well, anyone who's played the broken telephone game knows that, where you have to whisper the same phrase around a circle, and when you get back to the original person, you find a very different phrase being uttered. But testimony allows us to share our experiences. We can benefit from what others have experienced without ourselves directly experiencing it, and this seems to be why we value testimony. John Vervaeke notes that it's by internalizing the sage that we become wise, by taking the sage's testimony, not by some memorization of facts, but by learning from the sage's experience. That's what gives us wisdom. Now, in religion, most of the basic texts are closed. The canon is closed, and these are our texts. But the artistic responses, the paintings, the music that is inspired by religion, this is open. There's a tremendous opportunity to convey new testimony. And with cognitive science, we can start to kind of figure out what this testimony should look like. In talking about how myth promotes explanation but accepts none of it, Karst argues that we must seek out the unknown. The stories aren't so big for the facts that we get from them. The stories are important to us because of the journey that they take. We retell these stories for their own sake, not for anything that it gives us or anything that might be stored within. Stories are no longer simple narratives or retellings of what we've heard, but they become meaning-giving artifacts. The greatest of myths are independent of their authors. They need a cultural context, but they don't need a source per se. It's when the meaning is stripped from the myth and becomes an ideology, that's when it becomes dangerous. We have to keep the meaning and the stories, these myths, together. Now, Karst doesn't argue in favor of a particular set of myths. Rather, he argues in favor of their existence. And cognitive science needs to remember this narrative transmission, this testimony that the myths produce. They have to touch something in us that is very meaningful. And when cognitive science searches for meanings that motivate and orient us, it has to keep this important element of testimony in mind. Jordan Peterson has studied the correlation between political views and religious orientations. Now, people who are religious, they tend to identify as spiritual. And spiritual people tend to identify as religious. There have been several studies that have shown the correlation between religiousness and political conservatism. But spiritual ideals seem to motivate some very liberal political figureheads and movements, like Gandhi and Canada's own Tommy Douglas. So how is it that religion seems to make us conservative, but also has these liberal ideals? Well, in his study, he noted that people who identified as religious or who valued the services in the institutions tended to be more conservative, but people who were more spiritual, who valued a connection to other things, tended to be more liberal, even though they often cross-identified. And there's also the possibility that priming individuals towards a certain point of view can affect their political opinions. Previous studies had shown that introducing some religious concepts could increase prejudice, a conservative value. So what he did was he tried some spiritual meditation with people. And he found that this tended to prime them for liberal values. So depending on the focus of a particular religion, the political views of its followers could possibly be influenced. Now, this in itself probably isn't surprising, but we can draw from this that how the religion is structured depends on, or will affect, what its outcomes are. If the religion is focused more on bricks and mortar, on tangible things, it's more likely to be conservative. But if its spiritual development is the key, is what it values, it will tend to have more liberal values. So depending on what kinds of followers the religious movement wishes to attract, cognitive science seems to be saying, well, that will influence what its focus will be. So cognitive science can offer some framing to religion and can help us refine religion. Brian Cantwell-Smith has argued for what science needs to do, how it needs to change to enter into this new age. Jim Davies has talked about the importance of and value of testimony. James Karst looks at myths as the most important narratives, almost like testimonies of our shared experience. And Jordan Peterson talks about how the shape of religion can affect its adherents. So as I've argued, cognitive science and religion, they do have a long history. They've worked together. They've helped each other to develop over time. And I think that they can still do that. Now, Some people may be asking, do we still need a religion? If we can figure out what religion helps with, can we get rid of all the bad stuff that seems to be coming with religion, all the fundamentalism, all the prejudices? Do we still need religion? And I think we do. There are millennia of wisdom that has been handed down in religious traditions. And these testimonies are important to how we learn about the world. Now, we should be very critical of religion. This is very important. And I think cognitive science provides a way to look at religion critically. And I think religion also provides a way to inspire cognitive science into further investigations. I feel this is especially true if, and I really believe this to be the case, religion is a culture that exists to facilitate spirituality or the connection to oneself, others, and reality. And I hope that there are other people here who agree. Thank you.